It is 5 p.m. I notice people are still arriving, but since we have a big, important program tonight, I'm going to get us started and welcome aboard as you are arriving at the sort of the dinner time edition of the Rancho Cordova Luncheon. This is the first time we've tried this, and so happy that you are joining us. I'm Shelley Blanchard from the Cordova Community Council, and I am joined by my colleague Diane Rogers, who is president and CEO of the Rancho Cordova Chamber of Commerce. She's also the technology wizard behind the curtain tonight. So we are both happy that you joined us tonight. You know, the coronavirus is a big and important topic, and Diane and I agreed to just jump right in with our guest speaker tonight. There should be some time for questions, so please enter them in the Q&A function as we're traveling along the road here. At about 5 minutes to 6, I will interrupt with a time check to start the wrap up, as I know most of you have a hot date with your television at 6 p.m. for the presidential debate tonight. So we are recording this program and we will post it on YouTube soon. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Rancho Cordova Mayor David Sander, PhD. Dr. Sander may be the only mayor in the world who also has a doctoral degree in virology, the study of viruses. That gives him a truly unique perspective as both a scientist and an elected official serving during this unprecedented time in our world history. He's a graduate of St. Louis University and went on to become a graduate fellow at Tulane University in New Orleans School of Medicine, where he received honors for excellence in research and a PhD in cellular and molecular biology. I can barely say it, forget about earning the degree, as you can see. He worked in the U.S. Congress, developing public policy as a Congressional Science Fellow. And then after moving to Rancho Cordova, he became a very active community volunteer and leader, elected to the first Rancho Cordova City Council in 2002, and he's been reelected several times and is currently the mayor of Rancho Cordova. So David, with that, I have to ask what everybody's wondering. What's a nice scientist like you doing in a place like this? And by that, I mean politics.
Well, that is the age-old joke between all of my science friends and I. You know, they wonder, how did you go so wrong as to get into an illogical business like politics versus, you know, the far more logical world of science. And, you know, the funny thing is this year, those two came together in a way that none of us anticipated or wanted or desired. Maybe, you know, those of us on the science side thought it was possible, but we certainly didn't expect it. But it does put me in a terribly unique position right now. And so I'm happy to not only serve as mayor in Rancho Cordova and a councilman here for a lot of years, but I'm really happy that I have this experience and this knowledge that I can share with not only my community to our benefit, but also to the region. As you know, my phone rings a lot. I answer a lot of questions about things, and I try to look around the corner a little bit about where this pandemic may be headed. So with that, what we promised tonight was sort of a coronavirus discussion, and I'm going to turn on some slides here from my computer. Hopefully everything works well. I've got a little pointer that kind of runs around the screen. I will try to use that sparingly so no one gets dizzy. But I'm going to give you a COVID-19, a coronavirus update, hopefully with some insights. Hopefully it'll teach you some things you don't know. I'm going to start with the very basics, and we are going to move on and try to answer some questions that came in at the very end. So hopefully all within an hour, and I'll tell you right up front, if we don't get this done or if there's a lot of demand for more, we can schedule another one of these. It's not a problem for me. So tonight, here's what we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about what is a virus. We're going to talk about COVID-19, the disease caused by this coronavirus. I'm going to tell you a little bit about testing, different types of testing. We're going to look at the impacts this pandemic's had worldwide, our local situation in the state and in our county, what you can do and should do, what I think is coming next and you can look out for, and finally, we'll hopefully get time to answer some of those questions that have come in. So let's kick this thing off and talk about what is a virus. Well, I think this question probably confuses a lot of people, and so I have given you probably the tightest definition of what a virus is here. The very first bullet point right up here, a virus is a small collection of genetic code, either DNA or RNA, surrounded by a protein coat. And over on the right, this is sort of a cartoon of a virus. I'm going to keep using this in the presentation tonight, but that's basically what a virus is. It's a little bit of DNA or RNA, just like the genetic material that makes every living thing unique and contains all the instructions for our cells to build us and operate us as living things. A virus just has that genetic material. It's lacking all the other cellular structures that a normal cell would have. And to protect that RNA or DNA, depending on the type of virus, it has a protein coat around it. And so that makes it really tiny, which you're going to see here graphically pretty soon. Viruses are different from cells. They cannot replicate on their own. They can't divide. They have to infect other cells to do so, and often they kill that host cell. We call the cell they infect the host cell. Often they kill that host cell when they do it. Viruses are found everywhere on Earth. They're enormously numerous. There are probably 7 times or 10 times as many viruses as there are bacteria on the Earth, to give you an example. They are not cells like bacteria. They can't be killed by antibiotics. It's a common misconception that people get a cold and they want an antibiotic. Antibiotics don't work on viruses because they don't have cells. They aren't cells like bacteria. Antibiotics do work on bacterial diseases. And the only treatments you can use for a virus are either antiviral medications, or you give people a vaccine that helps them develop an immunity against a virus. And that can eliminate or reduce the impact of the disease that the virus causes. So that, in a nutshell, is what is a virus. There are a lot of types of viruses, and this slide will give you some idea, not by any means comprehensive, but some idea of the variety of viruses out there. So look on the left, these types of viruses. There are viruses where here's the genetic material. In this case, it's RNA, and it's wrapped up in a little coil. Inside a coil or a capsid of protein. So there's the protein coat and there's the viral material. This happens to be a plant virus, tobacco mosaic virus. There are other viruses that have protein coats that look almost like a dice in a game, you know, like a 20-sided or 16-sided dice or something. It's a geometrical structure made out of, you could say, pyramids, where you've got this protein on the outside and the DNA or the RNA on the inside. An example of this is adenovirus. Then there are viruses that have envelopes. So these are lipid, like fatty layers around the virus. There's protein still wrapped around the RNA or the DNA, or sometimes holding it in the center of the virus. But these are envelope viruses. They're spherical. They're usually perfectly round, or squished around depending on their environment. Influenza virus, HIV, coronavirus are examples of this kind of virus. And then there are some really weird looking viruses like this bacteriophage. This is the type of virus that infects bacteria. It has its RNA or DNA up here in the head, its genetic material, and it literally acts like a syringe and injects its genetic material into the surface of the bacteria when it infects it. So viruses can be really cool. And this is why I got so interested in studying them. Over on the right side, you can see all these different types of viruses. There's Ebola, famous Ebola, looks something like this here on the bottom. Hepatitis, hantavirus, you've heard about, rabies virus. They're all in different families, and many of them look different. So the point of the slide is there's a lot of different viruses. So I want to give you an idea of just how small viruses are, because they are tiny. They're much smaller than cells. They're smaller than bacteria. And so I'm going to run this little video. Hopefully it runs in a reasonable amount of time. You're looking at a coffee bean here, a grain of rice, a sesame seed. That's a grain of salt right there. And now we're zooming in. We're zooming in to see what is smaller than those things. Well, there's one of the largest cellular organisms, an amoeba. There's a paramecium. Here's a skin cell. That's how big your skin cells are in comparison. There's a red blood cell. And as we continue to zoom in, we pass yeast and we get down to, here's part of a cell, a mitochondrium. Here's a bacteria, E. coli, that you find in your gut. And look, this is the size of the viruses as we zoom in. Measles virus, influenza, HIV, hepatitis. So this is the size range where you find coronavirus. And if we keep zooming in, you find antibodies. This is the size of an antibody. that someone would produce to fight the virus. And if we keep zooming in, we get all the way down to the size of the atom. So this little video should give you an idea of just how tiny these viruses are, particularly in compared to human cells. Look, there go the viruses, there go the viruses, and there's the size of the human cell. So viruses are tiny things, and they're very unique, and they're very fascinating in how they function. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of that enemy. So our enemy in this case is coronavirus. Everybody knows that word now, but it wasn't really discovered until the 1960s. And this is really technical, but here's 4 types of coronaviruses. These are basically common cold viruses. We all get them, we share them, we spread them. We may get them repeatedly in our lifetime, depending on our immunity to the given virus. So these are very common coronaviruses. However, there have been other human coronaviruses that have cropped up in recent years that have not been as safe or as non-disease causing as the cold viruses. MERS is an example, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which emerged a few years ago. SARS, the original SARS, over a decade ago now emerged, and it was quite a deadly virus, but limited in its spread. And now, similarly, we have SARS-CoV-2. Now that's the actual name of the virus, SARS-CoV-2. It's for SARS coronavirus 2. That's the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19. So when you talk about the disease, you say COVID-19. When you talk about the virus, you say SARS-CoV-2. So sometimes these viruses that infect humans have come from, and this is often the case, come from animals that are also infected by the same virus. There's enough similarity between us and an animal that a virus is able to make that jump from the animal to the human. And that's what leads to many cases of human disease. So this is coronavirus. Now this is not a photo. This is sort of what we might call a cartoon or a graphic, but you see the core parts and the important parts of the coronavirus here. So on the very inside, you have what's called a nucleocapsid protein, and that's where the genetic material is. In the case of coronavirus, it's RNA. So it's an RNA genetic material that is surrounded with a nucleocapsid protein to protect it. There are spike proteins on the surface of this virus. That's how the virus attaches to your human cells. There are other functions here, envelope proteins, membrane proteins that exist, and this lipid layer around the outside. That lipid layer makes this virus a little more vulnerable to environmental conditions than viruses that just had, for example, a protein coat might be. So this is an enveloped RNA virus, the coronavirus. And as I go on through these talks or through these slides, you're going to see other interesting aspects. So one way we can look at this is through an electron microscope. So now you're going to see an actual photo of SARS-CoV. And there it is. So this is one virus up here at the top. Here's another virus right here, and another and another. There's 4 viruses in this electron micrograph. And now you can see why they were called coronaviruses when they were discovered. Because there is a corona, a crown, surrounding each part of the main body of the virus. And so these are those proteins that are on the outside that attach to cells. Let me go back. That attach to cells, and they make up this corona-like image around the core part of the virus. That's why it's called a coronavirus, because that's just what it looks like. So there you go. There's your image of SARS-CoV-2. Let's talk a little bit about how they work. So here's up in the upper left, here's a little cartoon image again. There's SARS-CoV-2, and it attaches to the cell. It uses a receptor. Now that's a protein that's found on some human cells. It attaches to that protein. This is a normal protein. It has all sorts of normal functions for us. It's nothing special about it. The virus attaches, and by attaching, it eventually pulls its membrane into contact with the cell membrane, and it merges with the cell. And when that happens, the stuff that's on the inside of the virus gets pushed into the cell. And as soon as that happens, this is when the virus starts to use the cellular machinery to make copies of itself. So here's that viral genome, that viral genetic material. It gets injected into the cell. And what immediately happens is that it is treated just like cellular RNA, and it's used to make proteins. RNA in a normal cell, this is an RNA genome from the virus. RNA in a normal cell is used by ribosomes to make proteins. And so the cell just picks up this RNA and treats it like any other cellular RNA and starts making proteins. But in this case, it's not making proteins for the health of the cell. it's making proteins of the virus and that replicate the virus. So it carries on with that activity. Translation and RNA replication happens. The virus has proteins that will copy its genome and make more and more copies of its genome. And then eventually, again, using the machinery of the cell that's now kind of been taken over by this viral infection, it starts making more viruses. And so the coronavirus, having infected the cell, taken over some machinery of the cell, is now packaging itself up and releasing more viruses from the cell, having tricked the cell into doing this. And that, in a nutshell, is how SARS-CoV-2 infects the cell and replicates itself. There's other information here about each of these steps allows a drug, perhaps, or and that's going to be a problem. Some politician calling my house. Each of these steps allows for a drug intervention. Chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine was, of course, talked about a lot. Remdesivir is still being talked about a lot as ways to interrupt different steps in this cycle. So if you look again with electron micrographs at infected cells, you can see that these cells are taken over to the point that they're about to rupture. There's so many viruses being produced in them that look at these cells, they are just absolutely filled up with viruses that have taken over the machinery of the cell and are producing more and more viruses. That's basically how it works. So this causes a disease in humans. When a virus takes over a cell, makes a bunch of copies of itself, infects more cells, there's a disease. We call that disease COVID-19, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that disease. So if you look at this graphic here at the top, we see healthy cells. This is the way a lung should work. So imagine this is basically attached to your windpipe. You go down into your lungs, and the trachea turns into bronchioles, and eventually you get to this alveolar space. And these are cells it's best diagrammed right here, way in the inside of your lung, where literally red blood cells are running in blood vessels around this alveolar space. Oxygen is coming in as you breathe. This red blood cells are picking up that oxygen. They're giving off carbon dioxide. So you exhale the carbon dioxide, you inhale the oxygen. This is how your lungs work, through these little alveoli structures. Well, when a viral infection comes along and infects these cells in the alveolus, it causes those cells to not function as well. And it causes the immune system to notice that. It notices, boy, something is not going on right in these cells. We need to respond to it. And when that happens, the immune system responds. Various immune cells, this is the response, sort of listed right here, come in and try to deal with that infection. So inflammation can occur here, and fluid can build up in that alveolus. Now, as fluid builds up in that alveolus because of the immune response, the ability of that, and we keep flipping back here, the ability of that alveolus to function in its normal way is limited because there isn't as much air that can get in and out. And so this is what happens in cases of pneumonia or just severe lung infections, when fluid builds up in the lungs and there just isn't enough surface area left for this alveolus and this part of the lung to function the way it's supposed to. And so eventually that fluid can fill it up and basically take that alveolus offline, and it no longer functions. So that's the risk of the disease. Let's look a little bit about the pattern of people catching the disease in the US. So on the left, this is data from the CDC. On the left, you see, here's cases by age group. So how many cases of COVID-19 have we seen for different age groups? And you can see from 0 to 4 and to 5 to 17 age groups, for example, very few cases comparatively to the other. The bulk of the cases are happening in individuals between 18 and 64, sort of these bigger bars right here. And then, of course, with age, our population diminishes and the number of cases also declines. Now, interestingly, those are the cases. Where are the deaths occurring? People who get the most ill from COVID, where are those deaths occurring? Well, that is an entirely different age group from who's actually catching it. So if you look over on the right, you see the deaths, and it's pretty much a constant upswinging, sort of like a curve. The older you get, the greater risk you're at. And so there are very few deaths among the young. These are nationwide numbers captured from just not that many, probably a month ago, under 100 nationwide for kids under the age of 18. But if you look at, people 75 and over, that was accounting for nearly 40,000 in comparison. So there's a huge skew with age for who is actually dying and getting severely ill with the disease. As a matter of fact, if you look at CDC data on it, the average age of death in the CDC statistics is 78.6 years. That's the average. Average age of death from COVID-19 is 78.6 years. That's a remarkably sort of aged statistic. Underlying medical conditions, someone asked me a question about this. They're present about 83% of the time, at least one. But in those deaths, 54% of the time, there's two underlying medical conditions. 30% of the time, there's three. There's clearly more and more risk the more underlying medical conditions you have. And we're talking about cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, chronic lung disease, or immunosuppression of some kind. Some other facts about the disease: it typically lasts about 2 weeks. Symptoms show up somewhere between 2 and 14 days after exposure. And I would err very much on the 2 end of that scale. The 14, I think, is kind of an outlier. But symptoms basically show up about 2 days, maybe 3, maybe 4 days after you are exposed to the virus. The funny thing is, though, you're infectious for 2 days before, roughly, maybe 18 hours or something. There's some time period before you actually have symptoms that you're infectious. And then about 10 days again from the start of symptoms until you end up not being infectious. So there's a good 12 days in there where you can spread the virus. Over here on the right, this is just a graphic from the CDC showing where cases and deaths have occurred. And in this particular case, this is the death rate in deaths per 100,000 people. So when you look across the nation, you can see a huge variability in deaths per 100,000 people in different states. The darker colors here indicate a greater number of deaths for every 100,000 people. So you can see the Northeast was hit particularly hard. So another question people ask all the time about COVID-19 is, what is the fatality rate from infection? Well, originally, way back in March, the World Health Organization thought it's about 3.4% based on data coming from China. In New York, where they've got 12.5% of the population exposed to the virus, maybe as high as 20% in New York, compared to 1 or 2 or maybe as high as 5% here in California. We're really not sure yet. They found their infection fatality rate at about 2.9%. So this infection fatality rate is telling you, if you catch it, what's your likelihood of dying. So remember, a lot of the earlier cases were in New York. So their infection fatality rate was 2.9%. Right now, though, the CDC is estimating that infection fatality rate is somewhere between 0.26% and 1.4%. And it keeps dropping because we're getting better and better at treating this disease. We now know when to apply steroids. We now know that you don't want to use ventilators if you can avoid it. We now know that there are other specific interventions that you can do in specific cases that increase the likelihood of people surviving. So expect that infection fatality rate to continue going down. Infectious disease experts think it could settle to, oops, that's a typo, should be less than 1% with current treatments and maybe much lower. And just for reference, influenza kills people at the rate of about 0.1%. And infectious disease experts are now thinking it will settle to less than 1%, maybe even 0.5% with treatments. So that's good news. We went from 3.4% to less than 1%. There's also data that shows that the United States has the greatest success in treating COVID. Certainly we're among the best cohort in doing that. So let's look at those worldwide impacts a little bit. So here are cumulative deaths per million people. The virus is not spread equally all over the world, and the data collected is not equal. So this can be a hard comparison to make. There is a little video that I'm going to play that goes with this, and it'll show you, here we go, starting from China, spreading out, how the virus sort of spread all over the world, and the death rate followed. So you've got Spain, Italy, Belgium, the UK, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Mexico, the United States, all at a relatively high death rate per 100,000. But we also have relatively high exposures per 100,000. Other countries, China sort of cut off their data from the rest of the world, so we're not quite sure what's happening there. Some states like India don't have comprehensive data. Russia, we're not sure of the data. Iran, the data is very suspect. So you got to take all this with a grain of salt. Many countries in Africa don't have the infrastructure to do wide testing. So if you don't do much testing, your deaths per 100,000 actually look lower because you don't know what people died from. But in any case, that's some data on how it spread around the world and what it looks like in terms of death rate. There's some other interesting worldwide data. So this is a graph that sort of represents what we just looked at. And one of the quiz questions of the night is, what is this country, San Marino? It's actually a fascinating little story if you choose to read it up, but they have the highest death rate per million people in the world. They're also a very small country, you may have guessed. The United States sort of shows up here in the middle of this crowd of countries that have reasonably good data about deaths per million people. So we're kind of in the middle of the herd right there. Real outlier is Germany. Their ability and their public health infrastructure is amazing. They have really contained the virus, and so they are sort of standing out on their own as a developed country with good data that we can compare to everybody else, but a very low death rate per million people. And in terms of testing, boy, this is talked about so much early in the year. It's interesting to see how this has turned out. The United States is pretty much killing it, I would say, with COVID tests. We are doing more COVID tests per 1,000 people than any other country. It's not really close at this point, certainly in this data set, way above some of the countries that are more economically challenged, or even those that have, in case of Germany, we're way out testing Germany, but they are still having many, many fewer cases. Okay, let's talk about our local situation as we sort of dive down from the world. Here's a map of California, and this is that risk tier assessment that you've heard so much about. You may have heard today, Sacramento County got moved from the widespread category, which people call purple. We got moved down into the substantial risk category, which is red, and we're hoping to get down to moderate. Now, there are numbers that are associated with each of these levels, and so basically each county is measured with those statistics, trying to figure out what your risk level is. And as of today, Sacramento County transitioned from the purple widespread level to the red substantial level. And that allows more businesses to be open, and allows schools to open in a couple weeks if we can stay at this level. It allows a variety of changes that way. So I'm not going to go into any detail about that. There's a ton of it available on the web. And of course, the city of Rancho Cordova has a ton of it available, as does the chamber, for businesses and people here in Rancho Cordova. Here's some other statistics on California. You can kind of see how the infections have run through our state, how this pandemic has played out. So, for example, here are a number of cases detected, and you can see, early in the year, we just did not have that many cases when the rest of the country, like New York or Chicago and Illinois, were having huge eruptions of cases. We didn't have so many, but we got ours. Ours came in July. And so you can see by the shape of this curve here in July, as we opened up after being shut down early in the year, huge surge in cases. And now as we clamp down again, you can see these cases coming down. Now there are certain little bumps here that are interesting. July 4th bump is probably right here. Activities around the 4th of July that had people mixing together probably contributed some to there. And this little bump right here is probably Labor Day. Interestingly enough, happening a couple of weeks after Labor Day festivities. Total deaths in California have mirrored total cases, but what's interesting in the curve is you can tell we've gotten better at treating this disease because these two curves are not the same. The curve here actually shows more deaths early on and not as many now, whereas the exposure and case rate went markedly up over what we saw in the spring. So that's good news. We're getting better at treating the disease. And we're looking at just Sacramento County statistics. So this is similar to that exposure, number of cases. The graph looks a little rougher because we're zoomed down just to Sacramento County, and it gets spiky with sort of this repetitive pattern because of weekends. There's fewer reports on Saturday and Sunday, and then Monday is often a catch-up day. So, but in any case, here's the spring in Sacramento County. We did not have many cases, got down to almost nothing. We reopened in the end of May and beginning of June, saw a bunch of cases. Here we are coming down, and our little Labor Day bump is probably right there on the right side of that graph. This Sacramento County COVID-19 website is pretty cool. It tells you how many deaths we've had. We're up to 416 in the county. Total number of cases, over 22,000 in the county. But it also shows, here's our pattern of infection by age, kind of similar to what we saw in those CDC graphs before. Here's cases grouped by age group a different way. This is 10-year age group, this is slightly larger. Male, female, and you can also see ethnicity here. Down in the lower left, you can see that Rancho Cordova's had 891 cases and 23 deaths. Sacramento County, Elk Grove, other cities are listed. You could scroll through that if you went to the website and wanted more information. They also give hospital information. So for example, today, there are 125 hospitalized cases of COVID in the county. 33 of those are in the ICU. We have a current active 105 cases in congregate facilities. That means nursing homes by and large. In congregate care, we've had over 1,000 so far, according to this dashboard, and 162 of our deaths have been in that in those congregate facilities. There's also great data on here that shows you how many people were hospitalized, that's sort of this dark line, and how many people were in an ICU, and that's this lighter line right here. And you can see how that has changed. Again, look, we had, ICU and number of total patients nearly the same here. We had a substantial proportion here, and it really changed later on, fewer patients in the ICU. And emergency room visits are documented down here. Big spike early in the year when people were really nervous about it, and it's certainly calmed a little with this later part of the pandemic as it came through. So we are going to shift now to testing, and boy, there's a point this year when I didn't even want to hear this word testing because it was being mentioned so often and so far out of context. I'm going to try to boil it down for you and make it as simple as possible, and then I'll offer a few comments about the import of it. So the question of testing is, do I have it or did I have it? These are the two main questions of testing. And there are now three basically ways of being tested and two types of tests. So one is testing, do I currently have the virus basically in my sinuses? So in the case of the molecular test, now this is the PCR test that you've probably heard a lot about over here that's labeled molecular test. They put a swab in your nose, and someone told me it's not so much in your nose as it feels like it's tickling your brain because they go very, very deep into your nose to get the appropriate swab. They look to see is the virus on there, and then they do a bunch of chemical reactions and tests to figure out is it there or not. This is the gold standard of detection. It's also expensive and somewhat slow. There is an antibody test that tells you, did I have it? Because this means your body has seen the virus, you have the virus in your body, it's replicated in your body, and your immune system has recognized it and started making antibodies. These don't show up until probably a week or two after you've been infected. So this test doesn't tell you whether or not you have the virus. By and large, it's telling you whether or not you had it. So antibody tests where they take your blood or they do a finger stick, that's going to tell you whether you've had the virus sometime in your past. And then finally, there's a newer test that's coming out, and these are great for screening. These are antigen tests. So again, they're doing a nose swab, hopefully not as deep as they typically do for this one over here in the molecular test, but they're getting a swab from your nose, and they're looking to see, are there viral proteins in your nose? Is there virus in your nose? And they use an antibody actually in this test, and the results can be done in 15 minutes. It's really quick. It's not as accurate as molecular, but it is telling you whether or not you have virus or at least viral proteins in your nose. So this is a great screening tool that you're going to see more and more of going forward. So again, the two that are shaded here will tell you if you currently have virus and you are infectious. The one in between, the antibody test, is going to tell you, did I have virus? So was I infected at some point in the past? So those are the two types of tests. Now, people look at testing as the single thing that's sort of like, I don't know, a cure-all, a magic thing, that if we just had testing, everything would be better. Testing is just a tool, and you have to apply it appropriately, and I've just taught you the two ways to apply it. Do I have it, or have I had it? Those are the two questions. Hopefully in schools and workplaces, you're going to see more and more of this antigen testing, and that's going to allow us to contain people who are infectious, and people will be able to contain themselves and keep themselves safe and keep themselves from affecting others. So look for more and more antigen tests going forward. Now we're getting to what you can actually do. And you've all seen this before, but I'm going to summarize it. This is a graphic from, I think, the FDA. First of all, wash your hands. You want to not get COVID. You want to not spread it. Wash your hands. It's the best advice. Your mom gave it to you. It's like kindergarten advice. Wash your hands. Have you been outside? Wash your hands. Did you touch something, in a store or shake someone's hand? Wash your hands. Before you eat, wash your hands. Before you touch your face, wash your hands. Just wash your hands. It's the best thing you can do to deter the spread of the virus. Next thing, wear a mask. Now, when this first came out, people were really skeptical about wearing a mask. And it's different and it's uncomfortable and we don't like it. But it turns out wearing a mask is almost as valuable as a vaccine in some studies for causing a deterrence and spread of the virus. So it keeps you from exhaling particles onto other people, big droplets that contain virus. It keeps you from spreading it. Does it protect you? Not so much, but it protects everybody else from you. And because you can spread it without knowing it before you even have it, or if you're asymptomatic and never have any symptoms, it's important to wear a mask. So wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart from everybody else. We all know these by now. And if you've got PPE, consider donating it, consider using it for giving it to people who are on the front lines. Everyone should wear some sort of a cloth face covering, though, in public. In terms of contact, the virus does not spread this way as often as we thought or expected. You should follow all good food safety guidelines, but don't get crazy about that. I hear about people bleaching bananas. That makes no sense. We don't have many cases documented at all of contact spread of the virus. It seems to be this droplet, person-to-person breathing. And, if you have the ability, please consider donating blood. There's a nationwide shortage of blood products, and this is a problem for not only research purposes, but people's health. So if you've got the ability to donate blood, please consider doing that. And of course, there's a ton of fraudulent stuff out there online. Machines that are supposed to do stuff and bad testing and all sorts of treatments. Count on reputable sources, the CDC, the FDA, the National Institutes of Health. Count on your doctor. Count on those sources for good information. Don't believe everything you read online, and certainly be awfully careful about those. So we are entering an interesting age, life in the age of COVID. I had to put some kind of humor into this talk, and I will talk a little bit about schools later on, but this is not going to be our future, okay? Things are going to be better, even though this might be what we feel like right now. All right, moving on. I'm going to talk about another topic here. Should you wear masks in public? Yes. Should you wear gloves in public? No. Gloves cause people to act dumb. Gloves cause people, and you've probably seen this, hopefully not so much anymore, but boy, a couple of months ago, I saw lots of people in gloves doing crazy stuff like eating with their glove on, rubbing their face with their glove on, touching everything inside with their glove on. Gloves make you feel like you're super safe, and they don't actually do very much good. Washing your hands does more good than wearing a glove. So don't do this. If you can avoid it, it's better for your health and everybody else's if you don't wear a glove. But yes, wear a mask. And you should wear that mask properly. Try to, if your glasses, like me, my glasses steam up all the time, get a mask that has a little metal band. It goes right over your nose. You pinch that thing down, keeps your glasses from fogging up, but it should be over your nose. Otherwise, everything you're breathing out your nose is not being stopped by the mask. And again, you're wearing that face covering to protect everybody else, not you, everybody else. That's how it works. I wear one to protect you, you wear one to protect me. Just try to make sure it fits snugly and around your mouth, and there aren't big gaps. The fewer gaps, the better off you are in the safety of that mask. And then I promised you guys I'm going to talk a little bit about something coming next. And so here we go. There is, as you know, vaccines are in development, and I expect those results to be out pretty soon. As a matter of fact, you could have some results released in a matter of weeks, according to people and friends I've talked to in that industry. There are vaccines that are now in phase 3 trials. There have been studies, data has been submitted, it's being tabulated. The seals that sort of blind the people who are giving the vaccines, they don't know if they're giving a vaccine or a fake vaccine or what they're giving. But all that data is recorded and kept elsewhere, so there's no bias in the reporting system. Those studies are being opened up. Look for that happening soon. I would think on an order of weeks, perhaps as long as a month, but there's going to be big announcements in vaccine development. And of course, we've got something like 72, I think, vaccines. Maybe it's over 100, depending on what you count as a vaccine in development, but there's so much coming we are going to have, I'm really comfortable in saying we're going to have successful vaccines. It's just a matter of time. But kind of like testing, the vaccine is not a magical panacea thing that's going to fix everything. Even if we get an extraordinarily effective vaccine, which I think, again, is likely, we're going to get an effective vaccine or a dozen of them, deploying those is not so simple. And the reason why is it takes perhaps a month after getting a vaccine to really have the immunity that the vaccine is trying to confer on you. And in many cases, these vaccines require 2 shots a month apart. So imagine a vaccine's available in January. You get a shot in January, you get your booster or your second shot in February, it would then be effective in March. So that's not unreasonable to think about 3 months for an individual. The challenge is, how do we vaccinate 330 million people in the United States, let alone billions of people in the world? That process, just in the United States, I've heard experts say, is probably a 6-month process. So if a vaccine's available in December, or if we, early see, great results and it's available in November, add about 6 months before we can fully deploy that. Many of those vaccines, particularly the ones we expect results from soon, are already being produced. The federal government did something really smart and basically took a risk and said, these look like great potential vaccines. Let's start manufacturing right now, even before they're tested. Because otherwise, you'd go through the testing process and then you'd have to wait 6 months to a year to actually produce the vaccine. They decided to do both at the same time. So maybe all of them don't work, but that's fine. That's a risk worth taking. There will be a lot of, like, hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines available, assuming some of these in development turn out as effective, which, again, they are likely to do. So vaccine deployment, it's going to be, I'm not sure anything like this has ever happened. You probably have to go back to polio vaccines or something in that era to even have a comparison for what this is going to be like. But everyone trying to get their shots, they'll probably start with those most at risk, healthcare providers in particular, and work on down from there. I don't know really details yet about how that deployment strategy is being planned. Also, something to look for coming next is there are likely to be antiviral drugs and therapies coming up. There are literally dozens, perhaps hundreds of drugs in development right now. One you've probably heard about, it's not quite a drug, but it's plasma from people who have survived COVID. And you take the antibodies out of their blood and their serum, and you give that to people who are ill. Convalescent plasma is being used right now. I expect more from that. And I expect more in areas like monoclonal antibodies, where they will synthetically design and produce antibodies against COVID that they can inject into people who are sick with the virus. And, in cases of diseases like influenza, we have drugs to treat people who are sick with influenza. And I expect by the time we're done with COVID as this pandemic, we'll have dozens of drugs available to treat COVID, depending on what sort of situation we're in. And the other bullet I put on here, I did not put on here, but perhaps I should have, was I do not expect COVID to be eradicated from the planet. It is simply, we are too big, too complicated. This virus spreads too easily for it to be completely eradicated. Rather, what I think will happen is we will become immune to it when we're young. People will be exposed to it. Our herd immunity will go up, and it will become something like a cold virus that we already have out there. That's what I hope. There's been a lot of virology speculation about that. And so in the future, people would catch COVID when they were a kid. We've seen kids do not get particularly ill or spread it particularly well. Probably all the young kids would end up getting COVID, and it would just be like another cold in circulation. That's the sort of best case scenario hope that we've got for the far future of this virus. All right, other questions? I think we probably have some that have been posted here. We had some that came in advance. I had questions about vaccines, schools, waves. I don't know if we're talking about that quite as much. Someone asked me about the meaning of life. I'm not going to cover an answer to that. That's a little beyond the scope of this talk. But there are some interesting questions here. Here's a list. I'll just go through some of these. One question was, are most of the people dying already near death, either by being very old or having severe underlying conditions? I had some data in my talk about that. The average age of people dying from COVID-19 is 78.6 in CDC data. So people are elderly, and typically they have underlying conditions, as I covered in that slide. But there is a lot of confusion on this point, some of which is being spread with almost, I would say, a conspiratorial-like notion that people are not dying of COVID, they're dying of everything else, and it's just being labeled COVID. I don't think that is a very accurate depiction of the situation. It certainly is not how death certificates get filled out. Lots of people are dying because they have COVID and another condition. It's not the other condition that sort of pushed them to the edge of dying. It's the COVID that did that. So COVID is to blame for these deaths. I know there's some, inevitably, in any human enterprise like this, there's going to be some error in reporting. But nonetheless, even taking, all sorts of conditions out for error, lots and lots of people are dying from COVID because they got COVID, and they would be alive if this virus were not here. So I have to accept the CDC numbers at face value. I think it's a good measure. Next question was, do face shields without a mask give any real protection? The answer to that by and large is no. A face shield is not a substitute for a mask. The value of the mask is that when you're exhaling, again, it's not to protect you, it's to protect everybody else. The value of the mask is when you're exhaling, those droplets that are in your exhales, in the air that you're exhaling, get caught on the fabric, the threads, the tiny threads that are in that mask, and they don't go flying out around you. And so that's the real advantage. Face shields don't do that. You have a face shield and you exhale, your exhalant just goes around the shield. So there's no particular barrier there. Now, in a medical professional setting, there is an advantage to face shields because some of the incoming droplets are blocked from like flying into your eyes or something if you're a medical professional. But face shields without a mask do not give you any real protection. I would not advise that. They do, however, have a role if you're a medical professional or doing some sort of medical procedure. You would wear it with a mask, not instead of a mask. So what do you do if you think or know somebody in your household has the virus? How do you protect the rest of the people in your household? That is a really big question. What you need to do is think about isolating that individual to the greatest extent you can. So you would try to keep them in their own bedroom, try to keep them in their own bathroom. This may be a case for gloves, where you would wear gloves when you're around the individual who is sick. You would give them all the supportive care they need, sort of like they have a cold, which is what many of the symptoms here are like. It's like a cold. You would watch their health carefully, obviously, be in good contact with their medical provider to determine what needs to be done. But you would try to isolate them. You wouldn't eat with them. You'd probably have them eat separately. If you went into the room with them, it'd probably be ideal if that individual wore a mask while you were there, and certainly you would wear a mask going in. You could wear gloves. You could throw away the gloves when you were done touching them or their things. I would wash their utensils, their bedclothes, their towels, that sort of thing. You can wash them with other things, but just be sure you use hot water, lots of soap, and use the dry cycle to be sure to eliminate as much virus as you can. Keeping air circulation in that room is probably good. Open windows if it can be done. And that's the best advice. I would urge you, though, to look at the CDC website, and they've got great information about how to handle that situation. And it is pretty complicated. Are there more than 2 variants of the virus out in public now? Is it becoming more aggressive? So there's this funny notion from horror movies, I think, that mutations mean something is getting bad or more dangerous or worse. And that's really not the case. Mutations are normal. The way viruses copy themselves, they make mistakes, and that's how they evolve. That's how they spread in some cases. They evolve and they find something that works a little better, and then they move on. But in the case of this virus, it spreads extremely well. And what often happens in viruses like this is they actually do the opposite as they spread. They get a little wimpier in some way because they've spread, so wide and so far that they don't need to be hyper aggressive in that spread. COVID, I think, is in a really sweet spot as a virus for its ability to spread around, and it's not killing everybody who gets it. It's killing very few people who get it, actually, overall. And so it's an effective virus doing what it wants to do, which is make copies of itself and spread. So are there more than 2 variants? This becomes a very technical question about what a variant is. There are different strains, but it is not particularly more aggressive or anything, and you should not be afraid of that word mutate. It's just, it's heavily abused in horror movies. Doesn't have any kind of connotation like that in science. Could you please go over the difference between flu and the coronavirus symptoms? Now, that is a really good question. So we're entering flu season. Everybody better get their flu shot, right? That's an important thing to do. But coronavirus symptoms and flu symptoms are awfully similar. So I think I even have, yes, I have a slide about this question. So similarities, COVID-19 and the flu have a lot of symptoms in common. They can both give you a fever, you can get chills, feeling feverish and chills, you can have a cough, you can have difficulty breathing or shortness of breath, you can feel tired, you can get a sore throat, you can get a runny nose or a stuffy nose, you can get muscle pain or body aches, you can get a headache. Some people may have vomiting, diarrhea. That's not as common in adults. So all those symptoms, those are flu symptoms and COVID-19 symptoms. So what is a differentiating symptom? You know, really the only obvious one is in COVID, a lot of people, I think it's on the order of 2/3, I'd have to look that up, tend to lose their sense of smell and their sense of taste in the disease. And so that is one sort of defining factor. But what the takeaway message here is, you need to treat any collection of these symptoms like it's either or both. Treat them as if you've got COVID when these symptoms arrive. And you need to isolate yourself, you need to protect your family, you need to protect your coworkers, you need to stay home, take care of yourself, contact a medical professional, and deal with the symptoms, regardless of whether it's influenza or COVID. Let's see, another question. Are asymptomatic people shedding the virus longer than people who have a positive coronavirus test with symptoms? So asymptomatic people are people who have COVID, but they don't really have the disease, or they have it to such a minor extent, they don't even realize they have it. That number now is estimated to be about 40%. Some studies have said it's 60, some have said it's less, that if you keep asking people, they will say, well, I did kind of have a stuffy nose. Let's just say 40%. So about 40% of people who are getting COVID don't know they have it. And they have a similar course of infectivity to someone who does have it. Now, my guess would be it's probably a little shorter. So rather than maybe 10 or 12 days of being infectious, maybe it's a few days off of that. But still, they're likely to be infectious for 7, 8, 9 days, possibly even longer in some cases. So there are asymptomatic people out there who don't really have disease but are spreading virus. The only way to catch them is to do a lot of surveillance, a lot of testing. So the testing that I talked about before, the antigen testing, there's a little swab up your nose and they put it on a little strip, do an instant test, shows up in 15 minutes. That's how you identify the asymptomatic people and tell them, you need to stay home for 2 weeks and try not to spread that virus that you have. Let's see, last question on this slide is, how is Rancho Cordova dealing with the virus without a federal plan in place? Our system was not designed to have, our public health system was basically never designed to have a federal plan that mandated what everyone did. In general, that is not a route to success in public health. What we do need, though, are effective public health measures that are applied at the appropriate level. So you need states making decisions at the state level. You need counties making appropriate decisions at a county level. You've seen a lot of fractious political activity over this point. I, for one, and I think most professionals would say, you don't want the federal government dictating in fine detail how we in Rancho Cordova should be handling COVID, because they're not going to be able to get down to our fine level of detail in what we need to do. For example, someplace in California, a county like, I don't know, Shasta County, with low population compared to Los Angeles County, the commonalities between those two in dealing with COVID are going to be extremely different. Trying to say that the state should mandate exactly how that works doesn't even make sense. That's why we leave it to counties. Counties seem to be an appropriate unit for that level of decision making. Now, you can be informed by federal sources, the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, et cetera. You can be informed by the state, but decision making, and this is the whole premise actually of local government in our nation, is that decisions made closest to the people are better decisions. They need to be informed, but beyond that information, that's usually the best level for decision making. So we don't, as Rancho Cordova, we don't need to rely on any kind of federal planning here in order to deal with coronavirus. It's much more of a state and county level. particularly county level responsibility. The other thing I should say is, as a city, we don't have any responsibilities with regard to specific health measures. Those are all reserved to counties in the state of California. So I am not sure how much time I have left, but I do think we have some questions that have been posted.
Right. David, we've got about 5 minutes.
Okay.
It's 5 minutes to, and I'm kind of scrolling through the questions that are in the chat. And then someone else has emailed me a question about kids going back to school. So there's a question here: is it safe to touch a slide or a swing that someone has touched in a park? And then as we approach sending kids back to school, what's your those kinds of issues? What do you think?
The school question. I've been privy to some of the the inside planning, I'll say, with regard to reopening schools. And as long as they are following all the precautions that the county health officer and the CDC have laid out, where kids wear masks and their desks are separated, they're not mixing at meal times, their recesses are structured differently, PE is structured differently. They may have segregated cohorts within the student population, group A, group B, that sort of thing. As long as they're following those sorts of guidelines, there is really no evidence that there's a giant risk in schools. If you compare our situation in the United States with regard to school openings to what's going on in Europe, it is an extraordinarily different situation. European schools are open. They kind of look at us oddly in the US for how we're handling it. I've had virologists, ask me on the phone, have you guys gone crazy in the United States? Calling from other countries. As long as our population, exposure to the virus is as low as it is, and it's, right now, Sacramento County, I don't know, you might say 3% of the population has had it, maybe 5% of the population has had it, but currently active is probably 1% or less. So you just sort of think about that. 1 in 100 people might have the virus, and then what's their ability to spread it? It seems that kids perhaps do not spread it as well. They certainly don't get as ill. There are not many cases worldwide where you can see viral spreads emanating from schools. And in many cases, they aren't taking the precautions we are. So we're playing it very safe with the proposed school reopenings. And the risk is much smaller than what we would have anticipated. So that's my estimation of it. I think the CDC is pretty much on record saying the same thing. So I would feel comfortable sending my son back to school, assuming the appropriate precautions are being taken.
Okay. We heard today that moving from purple to red will open up parks and allowing,
Yep.
Does the same apply to like play equipment in a park, do you think?
I think so, yeah. There was a study done early on that the virus doesn't survive so well out in the open, particularly in sunlight. It's unlikely. I'm trying to think of any documented cases of playground spread of COVID. I'm not sure any of those exist. I would think that it's probably pretty safe. But you know what you need to do after you play on the playground?
Wash your
hands. Wash your hands. Use the hand sanitizer, the alcohol-based ones, whatever it is. Wash your hands. Do it while you're playing on the playground or before. It doesn't matter. That's the best advice.
Well, we've got about 2 minutes left, David. Do you want to just kind of wrap it up for us before we say goodnight and turn on our presidential candidates?
Well, I know there's some other event that we're rushing through this to get to. So, there was a lot of interest in this talk, and I've been releasing videos, as mayor in Rancho Cordova, and I've been answering people's questions online, and, through personal emails and contacts. And I'm very interested in continuing this, as we go forward. I didn't realize I didn't anticipate there'd be this much demand for a talk like this. But if there is a lot of demand or a lot of questions that aren't being answered, I would suggest we just continue this and perhaps do this again in 3 weeks. We might have some vaccine information by then. I can repeat part of this or all of it or none of it and do questions, but I'm certainly open to that level of discussion. I'd like to be able to use my expertise to benefit, us here in Rancho Cordova and our friends and neighbors as much as possible.
Well, as we said at the top, I think we're really fortunate to have someone with 2 feet planted in both the worlds of science and government at this particular time in history. You're getting rave reviews in the chat, David. I will tell you that people are really appreciating your time and expertise, and we certainly want to look at coming back maybe at the breakthrough vaccine that we're all expecting. As before we sign off here, Diane Rogers and I would both love, and I'm sure David would too, love to get feedback on this session. And if you'd like to hear more, please shoot us an email so that we can sort of judge your desire to continue. As we said at the top, we are recording this, and we'll figure out how to get word to you that the recording has been posted, and you can tune in and forward that link to your friends who might benefit from hearing it. And with that, I think on behalf of the Rancho Cordova Chamber of Commerce and the Cordova Community Council, want to say thank you, David Sander, for just a really solid presentation, lots of science. I hope everybody got their science fix tonight. And we will look forward to continuing this very important conversation. So thank you to everybody. I think we're ready to sign off.
Thank you, Shelley. Let me add one little disclaimer.
Sure.
I am not a physician. Nothing I said tonight should be construed as medical advice.
Okay, fair enough.
It is my best interpretation as a scientist who studies viruses about what our situation is. Contact your medical professional with any questions like that. The other thing I want to say is people want answers. I understand that. Everybody wants answers. Science wants answers. But unfortunately, in cases like this, we're at the edge of discovery of science. There's a lot more sort of gray in the middle as opposed to clear answers on either end about answers to some of those questions. So I know there's frustration about answers shifting over time, and that's exactly what happens in a scientific process. So to the extent I can alleviate some of that and give you some of those answers, even though I'm acknowledging they're in that gray region where we're not sure, I'm happy to do that. But thank you all for the opportunity. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. And thanks everybody for joining us. Watch your email. We'll be making an announcement soon when you can tune in again to learn some more great stuff. Bye everybody. Take it easy. Thank you, Diane.
My pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening.